Hello and welcome to Jim and Ben's Movie Adventures. My name is Ben and with me is...
Alan. No, it's not
Alan.
me.
It's
not
Alan.
Me, Alan.
No.
It is Jim.
It is Jim. And this week we watched Jumanji, which was a Ben pick. I've got things to say. I don't want to jump into it, so I'm going to just knock out the synopsis real quick because it's a fairly basic synopsis. Jumanji, a 1995 film, is an adventure comedy film about a magical board game that brings jungle-based dangers to life. When siblings, Judy and Peter, discover the game in an old mansion, they accidentally release a series of wild and chaotic events. They seek the help of Alan Parrish, a man who was trapped inside the game for years. Along with Alan, Sarah, Alan's childhood friend, set up the game to complete it from the past. They must face dangerous animals, natural disasters, and other challenges. Together they must finish the game and stop the terror it has unleashed to restore order.
That is what happened. But why don't you tell us a little bit about the context, the facts surrounding this film?
So, released in 95, as I said, directed by, and I cannot believe we have not watched one of his films yet, because I know you, Joe Johnston, from Honey, I Shrunk the Kids, October Sky, and Hidalgo.
Sorry, it's the more familiar I am with the director, the more absurd the ones that you choose to throw out there are. Like, you know,
I definitely skip your favorite movies of that director.
You do every time. Like, you know.
He also may have directed like Captain America and, you know, The Rocketeer. Written by Jonathan Hainsley, who is an alumni of our show because he's written another movie we watched, Armageddon.
You know what else he wrote? Die Hard with a Vengeance.
And I noticed that as well, yeah.
I love that, like, your career trajectory takes you pretty much from Die Hard with a Vengeance to Jumanji. I'm like, that's awesome. You know?
Also, Greg Taylor and Jim Strain. Excuse me. Starring Robin Williams, Kirsten Dunst, David Alan Grier, Bonnie Hunt, Jonathan Hyde, who is the dad, and Ben Pelt. And Bebe Neuwirth, who is the aunt. Budget of $65 million, a box office of $262.8 million. I couldn't remember if this movie was a success, and I feel stupid now for thinking that, because obviously it was. This movie crushed.
It's tricky, though, because it's also like, this movie was definitely a success when you look at the numbers, but in terms of what did critics think of it at the time, they were kind of like meh. You know, it wasn't really on their radar that much. They were like, it's a kid's film. It's okay. But it was very successful financially. But then obviously it took a very long time to make a sequel. And even when they did, it was a sequel with none of the main cast that kind of itself delved into obscurity. And then it ended up getting a soft reboot. I'm just surprised, I guess, that Jumanji hits in 1995, was financially successful in the way that it was, and hit with audiences, even if critics weren't quite sure. Why didn't we get a sequel in 1998? Do you know what I mean? Like, that feels like a standard trajectory. But again, it was the 90s where they didn't feel like they had to do that, you know?
It wasn't the pattern.
No, that's right.
And I loved watching this movie again. I really did. And I think there's for a very few key reasons. The first is, it's very quick and done. Like, as watching a movie goes, it starts, it kicks into its action, it goes along its path, and then it finishes. It's like 100 and something minutes, like 102, 103 minutes long. Like, it is a quick movie. And it doesn't feel like it overstays. It doesn't feel like it bogs down in the middle. It just goes. And as far as watching all, like, the effects and things like that, because they went to such great lengths to mix in the practical on the sets and, you know, the things and all that sort of stuff, it kind of holds up. The CG's not good. Like, the monkeys look a bit crubby and all that sort of stuff. But it's still just a glance and you're over it. You're not stuck on those CG images. You're not stuck with them in any place like that. Just a lot of fun, very enjoyable movie, and would recommend to anyone who hasn't rewatched it to rewatch it, because it's a quick watch and it goes by fast.
Great. But, well, podcast over. That's a great one.
We're done. Nothing else to say.
I'm going to come back to the visual effects because you've touched on it briefly. But my initial thoughts, my overall thoughts, I love Jumanji. I have always enjoyed it. I liked the sequels to it because of my fondness for the original in a lot of ways. So I do think the sequels are fun, but there's something really special about the original. And obviously, Robin Williams not being with us anymore makes it, just that much more impactful when you go back and watch it. So let's talk about the visual effects for a second,
Yeah,
because this movie is kind of a magic trick in terms of its visual effects and where it sits in the history of visual effects. So, Joe Johnston, and this should be no surprise, Joe Johnston is a bit of a veteran or a master with visual effects. He started his career at Lucasfilm working on the Star Wars trilogy, and his job was storyboard artist and, in the visual effects team to actually put those things together. So what Jumanji does so well, even to this day, is mixing practical work with digital visual effects. And I feel like it's got to be his heritage, his background, his ability to do that so well, even in a way that is a bit different from what, say, Steven Spielberg was doing only a couple of years before. When you look at Jurassic Park, which was obviously this huge watershed moment for digital visual effects, well, CGI, if you like, what we would see in that is shots that were very carefully constructed that had a giant dinosaur in them. And we would either see a shot that was completely a CGI dinosaur, or we would see a shot that was completely a puppet. And then you advance to Jumanji, and what we start to do are these handoffs where we build, say, a puppet version and we build a CGI version. And sometimes within the same shot, we're cutting from one to the other, or blending, rather, would be a better way to put it. And it really does make you think a lot of the time, which am I seeing? Now, obviously, with this being such an old movie, those handoffs become more obvious, which makes it
yeah.
more fun. But if you were an audience member at the time, would have been quite difficult to actually know exactly what it was you were looking at. And obviously, there is a lot of very, very obvious VFX CGI in this movie. The stampede, the monkeys, even shots of the lion. But there are also shots that are incredibly well done, and even to this day sort of trick you. One that comes to my mind is there is a fantastic shot, which is a handoff from practical to VFX, where the car gets
Yeah.
caught by the vine and
Yep.
it goes in and it crushes it in two. And obviously, we know that CGI is really good at replicating hard surfaces like vehicles. But even in 1995, they were able to sort of trick audiences a bit and have this car do something that would have been incredibly difficult as it gets pulled into the bushes using visual effects. But they obviously shot a practical element as well and then blended the two together. So it's got some really cool stuff in it as you look
Like
through it.
my favorite effect in the film, and I actually went back and found the making of just to see how they kind of did it because I could kind of guess, but I wanted to see if I was right. It is that stampede scene that you mentioned earlier. Basically, they absolutely smashed through that wall in real life, and to do that, they built a life model blue rhinoceros, or three of them, put it on a air ram, and literally crashed it through the wall, and then basically replaced those rhinoceroses with a digital effect. And then obviously before that, they filmed Robin Williams running out of an empty room, and then they laid the two things over the top.
Yeah,
But
there's
you
a
create,
hidden cut, like a
yeah,
frame after he exits, right? So that it's
yeah,
safe when the
yeah.
rhino comes through.
But you get basically this real world explosion and destruction, and then you get this CG creature in it, and it looks pretty good because, to all intents and purposes, that CG creature did do that damage. It did hit that thing and break that thing, and then they've just kind of prettied it up. The other thing they spoke about in that movie was they're obviously talking about Jurassic Park, and they go, previously when we've done this, we got to do it with creatures, and nobody actually knew how they moved. So we got away with a lot of stuff. We could make up our own movements. He goes, but with all the creatures we're using in this movie, everyone knows how they move. Everyone can go to a zoo. Everyone can see these creatures on TV. So they actually took great lengths, especially with the lion, to kind of put naturalistic movement into its how it went with its both its animatronics and its digital effects. And I actually kind of really appreciated hearing that kind of level of detail go into kind of their thought process and what they were doing. So it was interesting. I really enjoyed watching that behind the scenes.
Yeah, for sure. And I would say with the lion has some of the most convincing animatronic effects that I've ever seen to this day. And a really convincing animatronic to me is, and if you're not sure, an animatronic being functionally a puppet that has a lot of gears and servos in it that is remote controlled to give it expression. And one of the things with the lion that I think is excellent is when they choose to show you the shot of the lion, it's usually very quick to the point where even when I watched it this time, I was going back and actually kind of frame by framing the shots of the lion because it is so convincing when you see it in short, sharp bursts,
Yeah.
that animatronic. Obviously, a lot of animatronic work does tend to show its hand the longer it stays on the screen in a single shot. So it wasn't just that it was a really well built puppet with animatronics in it. It was also what they decided to show it doing, when they decided, and how long they decided to show that for. And when they cut it all together, they ended up with a very convincing illusion, in my opinion.
So I think part of that goes along with the way they did a bit of the storytelling in this movie. So the whole kind of crux or mechanic of this movie obviously is the board game Jumanji. You roll the dice, you get a clue, and a real world effect happens. They really, especially with the introduction of each new thing, they really did the kind of hint, don't tell, right? So like when the lion's introduced, you see the tail hit the piano, you see a paw. You don't see the whole of the thing. When the stampede happens, you see the rattle and all that sort of stuff before. So basically you get this kind of anticipation of the thing before you see the thing, which gives the viewer a chance to build it in their head first. They get to kind of adjust their perception along with what's about to happen, which I actually think helps a lot of these effects hold up. Because you go, oh, a lion paw, I'm going to see a lion, okay, lion, lion, lion. And the human imagination is always going to be better than what is put on the screen. It's just the nature of how brains work. And I think they do this little trick, whether they realize it or not, to allow the brain to play a part. If they had just shown the lion straight away, it'd be a bit jarring, but you get to build into it. You get that kind of Jaws effect, if you will, which I really enjoyed. The other thing I want to bring up in this movie um, is the worst effect, in my opinion, and it is the monkeys. And it's because you can't do really an animatronic version of that the way they're using them in this film. And it's the faces. The faces just are rubbery. They kind of the eyes are way too human. Like it is a missed effect. And as I said, it's not because it wasn't the best they could do at the time. It was. It's just it doesn't hold up to anything modern. Fur doesn't look right. All that sort of stuff.
I think it's tricky. The monkeys, I feel like I can recall them saying how challenging they were because largely of the fur, which is where a lot of the effort
Mm,
went, because they couldn't actually do that kind of hair or fur effect convincingly in 1995. So they're busy trying to write software to make that a reality while at the same time having to animate the rest of the character. What does work well, though, is the level of thought and detail that they put into the interactions that the monkeys have with the
in the real
world that they're
world.
inhabiting. So,
Yep.
which would have taken an awful lot of planning, particularly when they're in things like the kitchen and they're swinging off the fridge and the milk's pouring out. It's making sure all of that is planned in advance so that when they do incorporate the monkeys in, it's going to look somewhat convincing. The other thing is they had very few advantages in terms of CGI with regard to the way they lit the movie, because everything takes place pretty much in broad daylight, which is very, very difficult for CGI, particularly at that time. There is nowhere to hide it. You just have to do it and see what happens and try and do it as best you can. And yeah, I think I'm with you in that the monkeys are certainly in the modern era the least convincing effect, but would have been one of the hardest to do at the time. And as well, you know, people look back. It's a little bit unfair, I think, because people look back at Jumanji and go, these effects are terrible, and then you go, well, actually,
Well, they're
there's
not
so
terrible.
there's so many of them in the movie,
Yeah.
and it was 1995 and it's all broad daylight, and I would be willing to bet that anyone who says these effects are terrible is probably missing maybe 60% of the actual effects, because those ones blend so well into the actual film. Like, there's stuff when they flood the house where I'm looking at it going, I'm seeing a model that they just exploded and then they composited it with live action elements and they've blended it all together. And I'm willing to bet that anyone who's like, the visual effects are bad, are like, well, you're not talking about that, are you? Because you probably thought
Yeah.
it was real. You know?
Well, the thing is too, like that set they built for that house is really impressive. Like really impressive. Like you don't get modern films because we do have the modern advantages of, CG and the volume and all that sort
Set
of thing,
extensions
set
and things.
extensions and things like that. But they for all intents and purposes built that house and then split it in half, like as the set of the house, right? Like, because in the making of as well, they were talking about like, hey, yeah, we were really wondering how we didn't want to have to, the cost of building two sets to split up to film the split and the earthquake was really expensive. And then someone's like, why don't we just film that last and split our set in half? And they're like, oh yeah, that works. And they did. So they did this thing where they had this kind of two-story-ish set that they could flood and do all these things, and towards the end they cut it in half and they could film the earthquake parts, and there's actual footage of Robin Williams standing on a plank and him going, the only thing I'm actually afraid of heights, so this is the worst. like it's an impressively constructed film, and it's very much a Joe Johnston constructed film. You watch anything he's done before, it's definitely his meticulous eyes, as you said, and his past experiences to make this film. Now, I have also a little secret. I have a podcast first. I read the source material.
You went, is it a picture book or
It
is
is
it
a
a.
picture book, and to be fair, I didn't read it. I had it read to me on a YouTube video, and I found it really interesting because the book is really just two kids playing Jumanji and animals show up. That's all it is. And there's a little bit of danger and stuff like that. And they end up kind of like getting rid of it and hiding it in the woods. And they see another two kids pick it up and take it off to the next adventure. But yeah, it doesn't have the story in it that this movie has. And it is just this kind of black and white hand drawn picture book. And I was actually pretty impressed. Like it was this kind of like, it was a more adult picture book. Not adult, but older age child picture book. And
Yeah.
yeah, so I just wanted to say I went deep on this one.
Say as well, we talked a lot about the effects, obviously, and how good they are for the time. I really do like the story and the performances and the characters in this movie. I am happy to see everybody on screen. And
Mm.
it's not a movie where I feel like, oh, when that character comes on, the movie lags. I feel like everyone works really well together. And in a way, this is where I'm sort of lamenting that we never got a sequel, because I want to see all of these characters more. I want to see their lives. I want to see what happens. I think that Robin Williams and Bonnie Hunt are excellent together as the sort of two adults there. Bonnie Hunt just has some lovely lines that are sort of almost motherly, but obviously she's not a mother, but she is, playing a little bit of that role for the kids there. When she's talking to Peter about cheating, and it's like, that's cheating, honey. Like, that kind of stuff. She's great. I just think she's excellent.
Well, our two main adult characters are in this weird position, and they're played perfectly, of this arrested development for different
Mm.
reasons, right? Alan didn't get to grow up because he was thrown into a jungle at 9, so he never was taught how to be an adult, one of those sort of things. He's still kind of a child inside his adult body, but with the stark realities of having to survive, he's an adult in some things, right? And then you have Sarah, who is this arrested development because she was basically psychologically scarred and then abandoned by her community. So, like, she was this kind of, she still has that naivety of a kid in a way, even though she's grown up to be a bit of a con artist, in that she is a psychic or whatever, or Madame Sauvage, or whatever she's called. And yeah, but they still both maintain that childhood kind of like aversion, that childhood fear of what they went through and what they've come back to. Like her reaction to the board game of just instantly trying to dismiss it from existence. It's like, no, that wasn't real. It didn't happen. Your father killed you, chopped you up into little pieces. And they're like, no, 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 I'm here. They both played that so well. And as the movie goes on, they become more adult. They become more parental, and they kind of adapt to their situation. And it's kind of a nice little weave.
It's really well done too in the writing of those characters, I think, because there was a real risk that sure, he's going to have that arrested development because he's stuck in the jungle, but there was a risk that she sort of progressed and didn't have that. And then, of course, they're also playing a bit of an underlying romance between the characters, and you don't want a power imbalance where she has all of this worldly
Knowledge.
knowledge that he doesn't have. And so, by saying, actually, no, well, she was traumatized as well and has had real trouble moving on and also has all of these issues which kind of leave her in that child zone, it kind of allows them as adults to be on a more level playing ground, which as equals then allows the romantic tension to take place, which I think was really clever. And then the other thing that the movie does, which I really appreciated, and I don't think I'm overanalyzing. It's a single throwaway line of dialogue, but at the very end of the film, when they return to their childhood forms, her character says, I'm already forgetting what it's like to be a grown up. And I'm like, good. So the movie's also thought of that. They've built in the
Yeah.
mechanism of, okay, they're going to return to childhood and actually go through as children. Do you know what I mean? They might remember the events, but they're not going to dwell on them. And, you know, the game's got some kind of mechanism to protect them from kind of having this double life, if you know what I mean.
So basically, they have all these memories, but none of the emotion that goes with it. And then that even goes so much further into the glimpse of their adulthood and finally getting to meet the children again. And they obviously have a memory of events because they know what had happened to their parents. And they're like, you know, before you start with the company, we're going on holidays. And like, no, 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 don't do that. Don't. We want you to start straight away. It's so important. So it is that really kind of nice button on the film. We've also kind of skipped talking about a really major theme in this film, and that is Alan's fear of his father and how that translates into the game. And as a child, I don't remember connecting the two things together, but obviously I have previously, in that Alan's dad is very stern, very proper, very business orientated, obviously cares for his son, but his son in that moment can't see it or feel it. And then he spends all that time in the jungle, and then we come to find out that the whole time he's been in that jungle, whether he realizes it or not, he's been hunted by his greatest fear in the representation of Van Pelt, who is played by the same actor as his father, in Jonathan Hyde. And you get this kind of really nice, without hitting you over the head, messaging of like, you know, his fear of his father didn't stop just because he was in the jungle. It was still there. And then you also see it even further in that the way Alan thinks he needs to be adult, he starts mirroring things that his father did about responsibility and, you know, proper action and things like that. And then you see, kind of after Peter cheats, that he kind of realizes that, oh, that's not my path, that wasn't what I was doing, and he starts to come to terms with the fear of his father. And then you finally get that closure of, when they've defeated the game, they're back as children in Alan's home. His dad comes back in to get some scarf or something that he forgot to go to the party. His dad has literally been out of the house for 2 minutes. But for Alan, it's been 27 years. And he runs over and hugs his dad. He's like, I've missed you, and has this emotional moment. And even his dad kind of goes, oh, well, I do love you. Like, it's going to be fine. I think it's really simple. It's really nice, and it's really warm for this type of movie.
Yeah, it's super effective, and I do think that it's a huge strength to the film to build it around that key relationship. It also reminds me a lot of the double casting that they used to do in stage plays of Peter Pan, where
Yeah.
you would have, Mr. Darling at the start of the play be played by the same actor who would later in the fantasy world play Captain Hook. And
Yeah.
I see that casting dynamic is fully at play here, where Van Pelt from Jumanji is played by the same actor as the father. I also just want to say I love Jonathan Hyde, and my experience with Jonathan Hyde is literally three films from the 90s where he was the butler in Richie Rich, he was Van Pelt and the father in this film, and then he was one of the, I guess, explorers in The Mummy with Brendan Fraser.
Yeah.
And then he just disappears for me. And I'm like, I love Jonathan Hyde. What happened? Like, I'll always have these three movies, but I'm like, you were on a run and I could have you in everything, man. You're awesome. So I just wanted to, I don't know, give him a shout out because I miss that guy on the screen and I wish he was on my screens more.
When I was researching, I didn't realize he was Australian.
Yeah, well,
He was born here, and his family moved to England when he was very young, but he's still like Australian. Like, we claim things for much less, like as far as a thing. But yeah, like I mean, he continues to do and did a lot of stage as
yeah,
well.
right.
Like, that was his bread and butter, theater, TV, all those sort of things. Like, his last work on here is The Crown, so 2023. So like, he's
Okay.
definitely still a working actor.
I think I stopped watching The Crown by the time we got to seasons in 2023.
And he had four films in 2024, but I'm guessing they were, I mean, The Brutalist, but I'm guessing they were kind of smaller productions and things like that. But yeah, I definitely remembered him from Richie Rich as like, I have the mental image of him trying to be tough with the bandana and wearing the little gloves and
Yes,
stuff.
yes. Good time.
But very enjoyable, very kind of, his whole thing was that he's very enunciated. Like,
Yes.
it was, yeah, I love it. Love it.
Also, the kids do a really good job too. Now, obviously, we're familiar with Kirsten Dunst from so many productions, but it's fun to see her as a kid because we don't
Yeah.
have a lot of that. But Bradley Pierce as Peter
Yeah.
Shepherd, I think, also does a really nice job as well. So, and because in a movie like this, where you hinge so much of it around two child performers, there is a real risk that they're not perhaps going to have what we need to get through the movie. And in this case, they're awesome. They just do a really good job, very natural performances, and I think that they definitely glue the movie together as we go through. And Kirsten Dunst's character is really funny as well, with her sort
Yeah.
of lying all the time and that sort of thing is quite
Well,
actually enjoyable to
they
see.
they both have to play a vulnerability coming from a different direction, right? They're children reacting to a disaster in completely juxtaposing ways. One is retreating, one is quiet, one is hiding within their world, and the other is engaging with the world, but 100% on their terms,
Mm.
which is creating fictions that hide the pain. And they both play it really well. Like, they both kind of settle into the role. Like, Kirsten Dunst's character is quite dry. Like, she's quite almost like just casually lying, whereas Peter is all about the emotion in the face, is all about the vulnerability, is all about the quietness. And yeah, they both do play it very well.
I suppose as well, the only other thing that I want to talk about with Jumanji, you and I are the same in the sense that we love lore. That's Lore for anyone who's, listening. And I don't mean, letter of the law. I mean Lore, which of course is world building, mythologies, this
History.
sort of thing. So Jumanji is one of those weird movies where the person in me who loves backstory and lore isn't really being fed. But at the same time, any explanation that they were to give me is probably going to take away some of the mystery and the magic that we're dealing with in Jumanji. I don't really need to know that it was, I don't know, a malevolent spirit or a, god from another dimension that got put into the board game or whatever, but still a part of me kind of wants to. So this is one of those situations where the filmmaker is probably protecting me from disappointment by not actually by not actually telling me the backstory and the lore. But I have this thing inside myself where I go, I want to know, what's the thing? What is the why does it do what it does? Like, how does it work?
Along those lines, I had a very similar thought, but for a very particular part of the film. The start of this movie is the end of another story,
Mm,
in that the two children are burying the Jumanji in the board game in the forest. And it's quite clearly from a time where everybody would have thought that stuff was witchcraft.
yes.
And I'd love to see Jumanji in that setting because it's a completely different response. Like in the movie, there's the classic of when the children react to the game, right? When it first moves or something. And Alan and Sarah like must be magnets. And then you have later on, you have Judy and Peter going, oh, it must be computer chips. And there's that third moment that we miss because it's the end of a story where those kids would have gone, it must be dark magic or it must be witchcraft. And I actually think Jumanji in that setting would be super interesting because if you think people in our era are unprepared for those events, the people back then were really unprepared for those events. And it's a bit of a shame that when we do finally get sequels, we don't get that prequel, if you will. I think that would have been really nifty because there's obviously a story already there. We know it's happened. It'd be kind of interesting to see.
I do think the sequels that we did get, though, are very true to the spirit of this original. Particularly, now it's tricky when you talk about the sequels. Are we talking about Zathura, or are we talking about, Jumanji Welcome to the Jungle and Jumanji The Next Level? So Zathura is this sort of odd thing off to the side, which, is also based on a book. I actually quite like Zathura. Have you ever seen
Yeah,
it?
I like it.
Yeah. So it's a John Favreau film, but it's very similar to Jumanji. It's just set in space, with a whole suite of different characters and their house sort of, well, I won't spoil it. Go watch Zathura if you haven't seen it. It's an interesting movie and it's fun. But I guess what I'm really talking about with Jumanji are the true sequels, if you like, or the soft reboots, depending on what, you want to actually go with there, where we have Jumanji Welcome to the Jungle with The Rock, and it's now a video game and that sort of thing. And I like that idea that the game morphs depending on the time period, which is an extension of what you were just talking about. Must be magnets, must be microchips.
Yeah.
Now it's like a video game. And the game is whatever it needs to be in order to get people to play it in that particular era. So I think that's a tiny micro extension of the lore
Law.
of Jumanji, but again, not quite what my brain craves. But again, when they finally give that to me in Jumanji 18 and they're like, here's what it all was, I'll probably be like, oh, let's go back to mystery.
So it sounds like we both enjoyed our revisit of Jumanji, and I definitely did. Now, what I am a little concerned about is our next film. But before we get onto that, let me just get into the socials. So if you do want to listen or watch us, it's very easy to do. Our names are Jim and Ben's Movie Adventures. You type that into YouTube, you type that into Spotify, you type that into iTunes, you will find us. When you do find us, please like, comment, and subscribe. Tell us what movies we should be watching. Let us know what you think about the movies we have watched. We would really, really appreciate it. Socials have us in two places, which is TikTok, which is Jim and Ben's Movie Adventures, and Instagram, which is Jim_and_Ben. Now, you sent me a cryptic text message in the week that did not fill me with confidence about the movie you're picking. So, Jim, what are we watching?
Right. Well, look, I am a fan of cinema history, and one of the joys for me of doing a weekly podcast, literally, Ben, we're here every week. We're
Every
doing
week.
this every week. If there's 0 listeners, if there's 25 listeners,
Still
if there's
doing it.
200 listeners, we're still doing it. We could have also titled this podcast, We Were Doing This Anyway, right? Is what we also could have called it. So, with that being the case, I like to go back and look at key movies from the history of cinema that sometimes I have seen and I know you haven't seen, or that are just on my list of things that are, I think, important in some way and should be seen. The film we're going to watch this time, it's old. Just prepare yourself. I'm
Oof.
going back. I doubt you've ever heard of it. I'll put it that way as well.
Challenge
But
accepted.
it is from 1939, and it is, I guess, the start of what became the Western genre in talkies, if you like. So, movies where we were talking. So, this film really kicked off that movement, which would remain powerful in Hollywood for almost like 50 years after that. So, we're going to watch a film by legendary director John Ford, who is known for his westerns, starring John Wayne from 1939.
There's a real good chance I've seen it. I have an obsessive father and grandfather who both love John Wayne, so let's go.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, look, we're going to watch Stagecoach. Have you heard of this?
I have heard of Stagecoach. I have not seen Stagecoach.
Yeah, right. So we'll talk more about it next week. So if you're a regular viewer or a listener and you're like, that's out of left field, Jim, what are you doing? This one's for cinema history. So I haven't seen it. Here's the thing. I haven't seen it. And I'm like, let's look at where this genre kind of, I don't want to say began. They had done Westerns before, particularly in the silent era, but it was out of fashion when Stagecoach came back. And this is what kicked it off and launched it sort of for the next 50 years. And that team of directed by John Ford, starring John Wayne, that was the Western. And this is where that kind of began. So can you see how excited I am about it?
You're
I'm
very
just like,
excited. It looks like it's on Prime Video.
yeah, I struggled to actually get it when I looked at it on Prime. However, I did find it on a free streaming service called Tubi. That's
That's on Tubi. Okay, yep.
Tubi. So
Yep.
you can find it there for free if you want to watch along with us. I don't quite know what we're in for. It was critically acclaimed at the time, but it's a 1939 black and white Western. So who knows, man?
Look,
We could be.
I'm excited too then. Like, let's go.
All right, love it. So, if you're still going to join us next week for Stagecoach, then you now know where to find us. And yeah, I'm psyched. So we'll see you next week for Stagecoach.
Thank you so much for watching the podcast. See you next week.